Hello, gentle souls. This night we enter the pale stone hush of an ancient Egyptian temple, where even silence has discipline and sandals are discouraged, not for humility, but because dust clings and the gods are not fond of footprints. The walls are tall and severe, the air tastes like crushed lotus and baked limestone, and the priests, well, they are smoother than your favorite marble countertop. You might imagine yourself fitting in here, robed and contemplative, offering incense to Ra or Thoth, but no, you probably would not make it past the grooming requirements. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments what time it is and where you are tuning in from. It is always a delight to see who is joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, let the fan murmur, and let's ease into this night's delightful journey together. The temple does not smell like hair, because there is none. Not on the heads, faces, chests, arms, or lower extremities of its priests. These men, because yes, most were men, though we will wander to their female counterparts eventually, begin each day, not with prayer or coffee or existential dread, but with a shave, every morning, every evening, and occasionally, just for good measure, sometime in between, because to appear before a deity, even a painted one with the expression of someone deeply unimpressed, was to be perfectly clean. Cleanliness, in this case, was not a virtue, it was the minimum entry requirement. They used bronze or copper razors, sharpened until they could slice through a whisper, and occasionally through skin. Shaving cream, as you know it, had not yet auditioned for this historical role. Instead, oils were applied to soften the hair, though soft is a relative term when one's bathroom routine involves a knife. Egyptian priests were also exfoliated. The polite word is scrubbed, the more accurate one might be abraded until pure. It is unclear if they ever resented this, though one assumes that after several years of mandatory baldness, a little resentment might have found room in the soul. Hair, you see, was animalistic, unclean, associated with the chaotic, the wild, the foreign. The priests of Egypt were meant to reflect the order of the cosmos, and in the Egyptian worldview, the cosmos was hairless. The body, stripped of its natural growth, became a kind of sacred surface, a blank slate suitable for receiving divine attention, or possibly disapproval. There were even purification rooms in temples, carefully engineered to contain ritual baths, stone benches, and maybe the faint echo of one priest muttering that he had nicked his shin again. This obsession with baldness extended into clothing as well. Linen garments freshly washed, and preferably unwrinkled. Any fabric touching their skin had to be ritually clean, which is ancient speak for washed, so many times it forgot its original color. Sandals were worn only outside the sacred spaces. Inside, barefoot. To walk among the gods with anything other than humility was to risk, well, not damnation, but probably some very stern stares from your fellow priests. And nobody wants to be side-eyed by a man who just shaved his knees for the third time today. Interestingly, the more prestigious the temple, the more intense the grooming rituals, in smaller, less glamorous shrines, perhaps tucked between a few goat pens and the neighborhood beer vendor, the rules might have been a bit more relaxed. A single daily shave, a quick rinse in the Nile, maybe a casual linen wrap. But in Thebes, in Memphis, at Karnak, cleanliness was so essential, it was nearly an identity. To be a priest was not simply to believe in the gods. It was to embody the divine through sheer, persistent discomfort. There is a fringe theory, charmingly persistent, that claims some priests may have worn thin veils to hide any 5 o'clock shadow that dared to return before the afternoon incense offerings. This is likely untrue, but the fact that it exists says something about the collective anxiety of sacred stubble. And then, the raven, perched near the temple roof, still as forgotten scripture. It watches without blinking. It says nothing. It does not need to. In a space where every human imperfection is filed, shaved, or scoured away, the bird remains unapologetically feathered. The priests ignore it. That is what priests do. Historians still argue whether the shaving rituals were purely religious, or if they carried deeper social implications. Were they symbolic acts of self-erasure before the divine, or simply hygienic practices adopted and then ritualized by an elite with time on their hands and blades to wield? Some suggest a combination, others argue over translations. One scholar once proposed the entire priesthood was a proto-spa system. He was not invited back to that particular symposium. Of course, there were moments of failure, a missed patch, a hurried shave, a priest late to morning rites because he slipped while bending over a bowl of water and nearly lacerated his ear. These were not tragedies, but they were inconveniences, and for men tasked with maintaining the delicate balance between heaven and earth, an unshaven thigh might have felt like the beginning of cosmic collapse. They shaved in silence, not metaphorical silence, the kind you find in overly poetic documentaries, but real, awkward, splashy silence. Talking during the morning ritual was discouraged. Some temple inscriptions imply that words during cleansing diluted the ritual's effect. Or perhaps it was simply that nobody wants to be asked about the weather while trimming their armpit hair with a dull blade at dawn. And yes, armpits, a point of continual debate among modern historians. Some argue that hair was plucked rather than shaved in these delicate regions. Others believe a poultice was applied to loosen the follicles. Still others think the priests simply endured. Regardless, there is no surviving document in which a priest complains, which suggests either remarkable patience or very strict editors. The grooming did not end with hair removal. After shaving, they anointed themselves with oil. Scented, of course, because unscented oil is for the godless. Frankincense and myrrh were common, as were less glamorous infusions involving crushed herbs, animal fats, and things best left unmentioned in polite conversation. The oils served both to moisturize the newly vulnerable skin and to create a sensory aura of divinity. A priest was not simply clean, he was meant to smell clean, divinely, intimidatingly clean. Occasionally, a novice priest would forget something, a missed patch on the calf, a linen wrap with a faint wrinkle, a sandal strap that had not been properly discarded. In these cases, gentle correction was sometimes offered by older priests. The gentle part is debated. There may have been yelling, quiet yelling of course. Temple acoustics are brutal. In modern terms, Egyptian priesthood resembled a luxury gym crossed with an exclusive performance troupe and staffed by men legally required to exfoliate. The gods demanded purity, the state demanded precision, and the priests, in turn, demanded razors. And always, overhead, the raven. Among the more fragile assumptions of the ancient world was this, that chaos could hide in a follicle. A single strand of hair, left unchecked, might as well be an open invitation to entropy. This idea, maddening in its thoroughness, gained real traction in the sanctified world of the Egyptian priesthood. The priests shaved not for appearance, not for vanity, and certainly not for comfort. They shaved because hair was what the other people had. The impure, the uncivilized, the people who, for some unfathomable reason, lived their lives with eyebrows and pride. Egypt's elite priestly class considered themselves vessels of order in a universe that leaned suspiciously toward disorder. To wear hair was in this view to resemble the outside world too closely, and the outside world was full of noise, invaders, unwashed travelers, and the kind of dietary decisions that would make a catfish blush. The sacred demanded the opposite. The sacred demanded sterility, not medical sterility, but a kind of theological blankness. A body stripped of anything that hinted at natural, unpredictable, mortal processes, and body hair. That was mortality's billboard. The Nile Valley, despite its reputation for abundance, was surrounded on most sides by desert, sand, heat, wind, and foreign visitors. That last one particularly irritated the priestly class. Hittites, Nubians, Libyans. Each culture had its own grooming habits, some more elaborate than others, but none quite matched the obsessive smoothness cultivated within Egypt's sacred walls. To the priests, body hair became shorthand for not Egyptian, and being not Egyptian, in their view, meant being not cosmic, not clean, and definitely not temple approved. Even the gods had standards. Gods in human form. Osiris, Horus, Isis were often shown with stylized wigs or crowns, but never with a stray eyebrow or an undisciplined lock. Their hair, if depicted at all, was intentional, decorative, controlled, symbolic, never biological. It is difficult to imagine any of them waking up and muttering about forgetting to shave their kneecaps. That was a human problem, and among humans, only priests bothered to solve it consistently. But this smoothness was not merely visual, it was energetic, or so the theory went. Hair, it was believed, could trap impurity. It could cling to bad spirits the way damp towels cling to musty smells. It could carry fragments of the unclean into spaces where the divine was expected to visit. And nobody wanted to be the priest who summoned a minor catastrophe because he forgot to exfoliate. Even funerary texts made note of hair, or the lack thereof. Some coffins include inscriptions that speak of the deceased as being cleansed of all defilement, which scholars interpret as code for thoroughly shaved. Apparently, one's spiritual hygiene extended into the afterlife. It is unclear whether priests brought razors into their tombs, but it is tempting to imagine at least one mummy clutching a shaving kit for the long journey into eternity, just in case the gods were feeling judgmental that day. Fringe beliefs surrounded hair like gnats in a summer field. One persistent idea was that hair, especially head hair, was a vessel for improper thoughts, that unruly minds were mirrored by unruly locks. A long strand left to grow wild might be seen as an open conduit for chaos to enter the soul. This is of course absurd, but only if you have never sat through a week without trimming your bangs while reading bad poetry. In ancient Egypt, the link between mental clarity and scalp exposure was taken with absolute seriousness. The cleaner the mind, the cleaner the head. There is a carving in a minor temple wall in Middle Egypt that shows a priest ritually shaving another. The image is surprisingly intimate, almost tender. Two men kneeling, the razor poised with care. There is no caption, but scholars believe this scene was not about grooming, it was about alignment. To shave was to purify was to serve, and to serve one had to sever every strand of self not devoted to sacred order. It is not known whether the Shavi enjoyed the process, but the carver clearly did. Historians still argue whether this fanatical approach to hairlessness began as practical hygiene, or if it emerged fully formed from some priest's nightmare about being judged by a god with particularly sharp eyesight. One camp insists that the desert climate encouraged cleanliness by necessity. The other claims the theology came first, and the habits followed. As with so many ancient debates, both are probably wrong in the right way. Amusingly, some foreign dignitaries visiting Egypt wrote about the priests in tones of mild confusion. Herodotus, for instance, noted with some fascination that Egyptian priests shaved every part of their bodies. He didn't say it with admiration, more like the way one might mention that a neighbor has recently begun wearing gloves to water their plants, curiously and from a safe distance. The priesthood did not concern itself with outside opinion. Its rituals were internal, self-contained, and self-justifying. If the priests believed the gods required something, that thing became law. Even if it required scraping your legs in a dim stone chamber while chanting the names of long-dead pharaohs, the laws of sanctity do not ask whether you are tired or itchy. Occasionally exceptions were made, but not often. A particularly high-ranking priest might be excused from certain physical labors due to age, infirmity, or seniority, but the grooming remained non-negotiable. Hair could not be grandfathered in, not even a ceremonial mustache. That would have been, in their eyes, sacrilege with bristles. Some temple complexes had dedicated grooming chambers. These were not spas. There were no attendants with warm towels or offers of scented tea. These were stone rooms with bowls, blades, and silence. A novice priest might spend half his morning in there, trembling slightly as he tried to remember whether the right thigh came before or after the left elbow in the shaving order. One slip, one nick, and it was back to the start, or worse, cleaning duty. Not every punishment was poetic. In these rooms, the only witness, aside from the watching walls and the faint sound of dripping oil, might be a raven, not always, but often, a dark shape in the corner, perched on a ledge, unmoving. It was unclear whether the bird was welcome, tolerated, or simply a coincidence, but nobody ever shooed it away. The raven's presence went unremarked in temple records, but its image appears often in the margins of ritual texts, sometimes near purification rites, sometimes beside lists of offerings. It never does anything, it is just there, like a punctuation mark from the divine. Once shaved, oiled, and wrapped in pristine linen, the priest emerged into the temple proper. His steps were measured, his breath shallow. He could not sweat. Sweat was mortal. He could not itch. Itching suggested hair. He could not be distracted, for distraction meant imperfection, and imperfection was the beginning of theological collapse. There is a strange beauty in this logic, the idea that holiness is not just a feeling or a belief, but a daily regimen involving blades, basins, and boldness. The sacred was not abstract, it was epidermal. It was located somewhere just beneath the skin, under a thin layer of oil and discipline. And still, even here, even now, the raven perches above the entryway. It does not nod, it does not blink, but it knows who has shaved. Some rituals begin with incense, others with bells. This one begins with a blade, copper often, occasionally bronze, never iron, which was reserved for more martial affairs and far less sacred pits. The blade was not just a tool, it was a theological scalpel. In the hands of the right priest, it could separate the divine from the merely human, and the acceptable from the embarrassingly hairy. Each morning, before the sun had fully declared itself over the temple walls, a priest would rise, not groggily, not resentfully, but with the dutiful resignation of someone whose job it is to fight spiritual contamination one follicle at a time. There were no snooze buttons in ancient Egypt, just the internal clock that whispered, "If you do not begin shaving now, the Eye of Ra will notice." The blade itself was usually stored in a small box, often decorated, not with pomp, but with reverence. The priests did not sharpen their razors in casual spaces. This was not a backroom grooming job with a bowl of lukewarm Nile water and a chipped mirror. The shaving ritual had a room, sometimes even a niche within a purification chamber. There, beside jars of fragrant oil and folded linens, the blades were laid out like surgical instruments, awaiting a sacrificial offering. The offering, in this case, was your own dignity. The first cut was always the scalp, not the face, not the legs. The top of the head, where thoughts were thought and judgment, presumably, could seep in through hair. A smooth head was a ready mind. The logic is questionable, but firmly established. Some priests took to this with serene calm, others approached it like diffusing a philosophical bomb. No priest wanted to be the one to nick his crown and show up to a morning rite, looking like a slightly shaved melon. Aromatic oils were applied before the blade touched skin, not out of luxury, but to soften the battlefield. The Egyptians knew that copper against dry skin was a recipe for scabs and regret, so they oiled frankincense, myrrh, juniper. The air in the ritual chamber would be thick with scent, enough to convince someone, briefly, that they were being embalmed, not prepared, which was not entirely wrong. Fringe beliefs occasionally surfaced, quietly, like a heresy whispered between bathings. One was that the blade itself held magic, that certain razors, having passed through many hands, gained a kind of purification memory, that a blade used by a particularly devout priest would in some way help the next man remain smoother, cleaner, better. There were even rumors of temple razors passed down like relics, copper thinned from generations of scraping, yet still used with trembling respect. And then, once more, the raven, silent in the eaves, where incense curls rise and vanish into old stone. It remains unseen by most, but always present, a participant in the ritual or an observer with opinions. Hard to say. It does not speak, but it sees everything. Now the process. The shaving of the head alone could take a quarter of an hour. The face, another 10 minutes. Arms and legs, at least 20 if done with caution, which it had to be. Nothing was worse than showing up with blood on your linen. Well, almost nothing. Showing up unshaven was worse. And priests did not merely shave, they chanted. Low, rhythmic, repetitive phrases, invocations to purify, not just the body, but the intention. These mantras were often so old that even the speaker did not know their meaning, just that they must be said. The logic, if you can call it that, was simple. The gods are old, older than meaning. They understand tone more than content, so the priests hummed phrases as they scraped. Historians still debate whether these chants were standardized across temples or invented locally. A few stone inscriptions suggest that regional temples had their own sequences, a head chant in Memphis, a face purification invocation in Thebes. One particularly verbose example includes 12 lines dedicated solely to the armpit, which frankly deserves the attention. No one wants to offend a deity with negligent underarms. There is a surviving record, fragmented of course, of a shaving ritual gone wrong. A priest slipped, cut his cheek, and blood fell into the sacred basin. The account ends in ceremonial horror. The basin had to be shattered, the water discarded beyond the city walls. The priest rotated out of service for 3 days, during which he presumably shaved more carefully. The lesson: the gods forgive many things, but not sloppy technique. Dry humor flickers through the centuries here. Imagine an entire class of religious elite, so determined to be pure that they willingly submit to ritualized depilation before breakfast. No razor burn exemption, no sensitive skin clause, just expectations, sharpened daily. One fringe theory tucked deep in an academic footnote somewhere claims that priests sometimes practiced on fruits, melons, specifically, that the shape helped, that the surface offered good resistance for novice hands. This is almost certainly a joke, but it has a persistent ring of plausibility. If you have ever tried shaving without a mirror, a fruit is arguably the next best thing. Once the blade work was done, the priest applied more oil. Not perfumed now, but cooling. A blend of animal fat and ground herbs, smeared thinly to prevent irritation. Think of it as the ancient Egyptian version of aftershave, minus the alcohol sting, and plus a faint scent of roasted papyrus. There is something paradoxical here. The gods were imagined as powerful, fearsome, immortal, and yet, to serve them properly, one had to be delicate, controlled, hairless. The very act of removing hair was an admission of one's imperfection, a daily surrender to divine scrutiny. It was not punishment, it was maintenance. And the priests maintained, not just once a day, sometimes twice. In high temple contexts where rituals spanned dawn to midnight, a midday reshave was expected. Not the whole body, just the parts likely to rebel against smoothness: chin, neck, ankles. In other words, the ambitious zones. This kind of redundancy sounds absurd until you realize that sacred performance is not about logic, it is about impression. The gods had to see their servants as flawless. If that meant shaving twice in one day, then so be it. If that meant trembling over a copper blade while cursing your own ability to regrow stubble faster than the temple schedule allowed, again so be it. Some priests became known for their precision. One, whose name survives only as he who cuts fine, was reportedly able to perform the full-body ritual in under 30 minutes. He was greatly admired, probably envied, possibly lied about. Still others approached the ritual with philosophical detachment. The body, they said, is merely the tool. It must be sharpened, maintained, and presented correctly. The mind should not dwell on discomfort. The spirit, if it is to commune with the gods, must pass through the skin without encountering obstacles like knee hair. Some modern commentators liken this to monastic discipline, others to obsessive compulsion. Perhaps both are correct. But in the stone chambers of the temple, with the sun barely risen and the scent of burning resin hanging thick, it would have felt like neither. It would have felt normal. It was just what one did to be holy. And still, always, the raven remains. The gods, one presumes, did not itch. Their sculpted heads were smooth. Their eternal forms, carved from basalt or painted onto plastered walls, showed no signs of discomfort. And yet, for all their serenity, the priests who served them were not afforded the same luxury. It is one of the more unfortunate paradoxes of ancient Egyptian theology. You could purify your body with oils, scrub your skin until it gleamed like alabaster, shave 3 times daily with a copper blade, and still end up scratching your ear in front of a god. Because lice do not care about ritual. Insects, unlike theology, are unsentimental. The Egyptian priesthood, those hairless paragons of ritual perfection, faced a problem too embarrassing to be etched onto temple walls, but too persistent to ignore. For all their shaving and scrubbing and anointing, the lice kept coming. It was the great unspoken crisis of temple life, unwritten, uncarved, but undoubtedly scratched at. Hair was the enemy, yes, but lice were worse, because lice were proof that hair had once been there, or worse, that it was attempting a comeback. In a culture that viewed bodily hair as a moral failing, lice were physical evidence of spiritual negligence, not officially, of course. No sacred text says this outright. But among priests, the presence of even one crawling guest was enough to spark a silent, linen-clad panic. There is no grand record of how lice were managed within the walls of Karnak or Luxor, but some clues remain. Ancient combs, fine-toothed, carved from wood or bone, have been recovered from priestly tombs. These were not decorative, they were weapons, often double-sided, sometimes inscribed with protective spells. The implication is clear. Lice were not merely a nuisance, they were a metaphysical threat. Oils were the first line of defense, scented blends infused with herbs, mint, thyme, garlic. Occasionally crushed lotus were applied to freshly shaved skin in thick, glistening layers. The oil gave the appearance of sacred readiness, yes, but it also made the scalp an incredibly slippery environment, more akin to a polished offering bowl than a home for parasites. The hope was that any louse who landed there would immediately regret its decision and slide to a disappointing death. It did not always work. There is a quiet absurdity in imagining a temple priest, recently purified, standing beneath a mural of Horus while trying not to itch the back of his neck, but such moments undoubtedly occurred. The temples, with their stone courtyards and shared water basins, were not exactly sterile. Blades were reused, combs were shared, towels, no matter how ritually washed, were not immune to nature's smaller participants. There is a fringe belief, largely ignored by mainstream historians, that some priests developed a sixth sense for lice, that they could feel the exact moment an infestation began. A single movement beneath the skin's surface, an instinctive shift in the scalp's temperament. This is likely nonsense, but one suspects it was a comforting fiction to imagine yourself as so spiritually attuned that even vermin could not surprise you. When lice were discovered, and they always were, eventually, the protocol was severe: immediate isolation, repurification, all linens burned or discarded, preferably outside the temple grounds. Some priests, it is said, would perform a full-body shave even if only one bug was found. It was a form of penance, self-discipline by blade. And then there were the ointments. Temple scrolls mention a number of these in roundabout ways. Recipes often began with a euphemism for the quiet affliction, or to drive out the restless guests. Ingredients varied, but common threads included animal fat, castor oil, powdered herbs, and, inexplicably, ground copper filings. Some were meant to suffocate the lice, others simply made the scalp an unlivable place. They were smeared on thick, then wrapped in linen strips and left overnight. The smell, one presumes, was somewhere between sacred and tragic. Historians still argue whether lice were genuinely considered impure or simply embarrassing. The theological records remain quiet on the matter, perhaps by design, but metaphors abound. The Book of the Dead refers to small sins that creep in silence. One can read this as poetic imagery, or one can picture a priest who has just discovered a louse and feels very, very seen. The real shame was not the insect, it was the implication. Lice suggested lapse, perhaps a skipped midday shave, perhaps a moment of distraction while anointing, or, worst of all, poor storage of linens. A priest whose scalp hosted lice might as well have walked into the sanctuary holding a spoiled offering. It was not a crime, but it was a problem, and problems made the gods look away. The raven never did. Perched high on a ledge above the purification basin, it tilted its head occasionally, feathered and unbothered. A silent witness to hundreds of failed hygiene routines, it never left. Some priests may have imagined it as a sort of divine familiar. Others simply ignored it, but none ever tried to shoo it. You do not shoo a creature that never blinks. Priests rarely spoke of lice aloud. In temple language, there were euphemisms: the presence, the motion, the interruption. Some records even include a phrase meaning, roughly, the disturbance that must not be acknowledged. This linguistic contortion was not mere formality, it was fear. To say the word aloud might invite attention from other priests, yes, but also potentially from the gods. There is one half-preserved papyrus from a minor shrine outside Memphis. It lists purification steps for the morning rite. Line 14 reads, "Examine the head for disobedient movement." Line 15, "Apply the oil of reassurance." What this oil consisted of is unclear, though the next section mentions the boiling of garlic and vinegar. Perhaps reassurance meant driving out every living thing by sheer olfactory force. There were procedures for communal cleansing. A priest with lice did not handle the situation alone. Fellow priests were called, not with shouts but with gestures, a comb passed discreetly, a nod, a slight retreat to the private chambers. No scolding, just quiet cooperation. Because anyone, at any time, could become impure. Today, it was you. Tomorrow, it might be the high priest's left ankle. There was a kind of dignity in this, a silent network of shared expectations. No one mocked, no one gossiped, at least not until the afflicted priest had safely completed his 8th reapplication of nettle paste and returned to duty glistening and slightly sheepish. Yet the emotional toll remained. Shaving already had its burdens: blade nicks, oil burns, dry skin, the looming threat of holy acne. Add to this the anxiety of infestation, and the result was a priesthood in constant low-level distress. They smiled during rites, they chanted the sacred names, but some part of them was always listening, waiting for that subtle itch, the tickle of failure. One minor inscription in a lesser-known tomb captures the spirit perfectly. Beneath a faded depiction of offerings, someone carved a small line of hieroglyphs. Translated loosely, it reads, "I remained clean even when they came for me." That priest was likely buried with honors. Some temples experimented with preventative measures. Cedarwood oil was popular, though expensive. A few tried sand baths, standing in hot desert sand until every living hitchhiker gave up and left. One radical suggestion involved ash, not for purity, but as camouflage. If the lice could not see the scalp, perhaps they would wander elsewhere. This method was quickly abandoned after several priests passed out from inhalation. And still, daily, the shaving continued. Not as vanity, not even as hygiene, strictly speaking, but as declaration. The priest's body was not his own. It was a vessel, a beacon, and if keeping that vessel immaculate required boiling garlic oil and publicly apologizing to one's scalp, then so be it. The raven approved, or did not disapprove, which was close enough. In the end, the war against lice was never won. It was merely managed, one day at a time, one ritual at a time, one awkward walk of shame to the purification chamber at a time. And yet, the priests endured, because to serve the gods was to rise above irritation, to choose smoothness over shame, to apply the oil of reassurance even when reassurance felt like wishful thinking. Because faith, like scalp oil, must be applied liberally. In ancient Egypt, the face was a battlefield, not for expression, but for ideology, and the beard, long cherished elsewhere as a symbol of wisdom, masculinity, or possibly leftover breakfast, was in Egyptian temple culture an outright act of rebellion, or at the very least a fashion faux pas so severe it could summon disapproval from stone idols. In a land where the sacred and the sanitary were inseparable, a beard was not just unclean, it was foreign. To grow facial hair in the priesthood was to invite suspicion, to be caught with it was to risk removal. Not public disgrace, exactly. Priests were too smooth for public anything, but quiet repositioning, away from ceremony, away from divine presence. Perhaps reassigned to scroll copying or back of temple logistics, somewhere safely out of view, because in the house of the gods, no one wanted to be the priest with visible follicles. It was not always so. Early dynasties flirted with the idea of beards, especially among kings. The false beard, a strap-on contraption, often woven with metal or hair and tied beneath the chin, was a common sight in royal imagery. But that was the point. It was false, a performance, a symbolic appendage for ceremonial purposes, never to be mistaken for actual hair grown in defiance of sacred hygiene. Gods wore false beards in art too, usually curved upward at the end like a cosmic comma. This meant something, probably, but it definitely did not mean priests could start skipping their razors. Real beards, by contrast, were associated with foreigners, bearded Syrians, Hittite Hittites, shaggy Libyans. These were the people Egypt viewed with suspicion, not necessarily enemies, but definitively other. They were drawn in tomb paintings with hair that went in all directions like cautionary tales in human form. The priests of Egypt, who strove for orderly silence in all things, did not want to be mistaken for chaos with a chin, And so, the daily facial shave, always part of the morning ritual, sometimes repeated before major ceremonies. A single missed whisker, left to flourish defiantly under the nose, could undo days of spiritual progress. Not officially, but unofficially, you might as well show up unwashed. Fringe beliefs about beards occasionally crop up in obscure texts. One scrap of commentary from a rural temple warns against the shadow of the lower face, believed to confuse spirits during invocation. Another, written in a slightly mocking tone, accuses bearded men of hiding their true intentions behind a curtain of flesh. These may not reflect mainstream temple policy, but they do suggest a broader cultural discomfort. In Egypt, the clean-shaven face was not just cleaner, it was more honest. There were exceptions, but not many. A few high-ranking officials in the Old Kingdom appear to have worn trimmed beards outside the priesthood. Merchants, diplomats, men who dealt with other cultures. Their hair was not a spiritual choice, it was diplomatic camouflage. To be taken seriously by outsiders, one had to resemble them slightly, but never in the temple, never near the gods. Historians still argue over whether certain obscure sects allowed facial hair under strict conditions, perhaps as a sign of mourning or temporary penitence. The evidence is thin: a few statues with stubbled chins, a suspicious line in a purification hymn, nothing definitive. The majority consensus remains firm: smooth was sacred, bearded was suspect. And yet, the gods wore beards, or at least the artistic representations of them did. Osiris, Lord of the Dead, was rarely seen without his elegant, tapered chin tuft. It was a symbol of divine authority, not to be imitated by mortals. Some scholars suggest the beard was not meant to represent literal hair at all, but an abstract marker of status, like wings on an angel or a modern CEO's Bluetooth headset. Decorative, aspirational, not practical. There is a particularly strange contradiction here. The priests, who strove to mirror the gods in every way, clothing, speech, ritual, posture, were specifically forbidden from copying this one feature. To put on a beard was to overstep, to blur the line between service and impersonation. It was the theological equivalent of wearing the crown to a staff meeting. And so razors remained busy. Copper blades, gliding over cheeks already tender from yesterday's scrape. Oil applied sparingly to avoid greasiness under the linen wraps. Occasionally, a priest would get too confident and cut too close. Blood was always inconvenient, not just because it stained the robes, but because it suggested mortality. The divine did not bleed. If you did, you were doing something wrong. Above, near the doorway, a raven shifted on its perch. It made no sound, but its head tilted as if in quiet appraisal. Perhaps it approved of the bloodless cheek, or perhaps it simply liked symmetry. Priests monitored each other's faces. Not formally, there was no designated beard inspector, but casually, a raised eyebrow here, a pointed glance there. If one priest showed up with a little too much jaw texture, others would notice. They would not speak. That would be impolite. But the unspoken message was clear: return to the purification chamber. You missed something. Temple art reflects this obsession with smoothness. Reliefs show priests with idealized egg-like heads and featureless faces, not a single dot or dash where a whisker might have lived. Even the statues of priests, carved from diorite or limestone, maintain this unnatural clarity. You would think they were wax models if wax had existed. And yet, there were dreams, human ones. A papyrus fragment, preserved in the Cairo Museum, includes a poem written by a junior priest. In it, he describes a dream where he forgets to shave and enters the temple. The god statue looks down, the floor cracks open. He falls through a tunnel of judgment, pursued by his own facial hair. The poem ends abruptly, likely torn, or perhaps intentionally unfinished, to reflect the dream's unresolved guilt. One fringe priestly manual, now lost except for quoted lines, described a punishment for repeated shaving negligence. The offender would be tasked with scrubbing the outer courtyard at noon, barefoot, bareheaded, and freshly shaven, of course. It was not cruel, just humiliating enough to discourage chin laziness. But the pressure was not entirely negative. Some priests took pride in their smoothness. It became a quiet competition. Who could shave cleanest? Who could go longest without irritation? Who could glide a blade over the jawline with the precision of a god's scribe writing on gold leaf? They did not boast. That would have been improper, but they noticed. The tools mattered. Some razors were passed down father to son, or mentor to novice. A well-honed blade was a mark of office. Its edge was maintained with quiet reverence, not sharp enough, and the shave would be sloppy. Too sharp, and the gods might receive a slightly wounded offering. There was an art to it, a rhythm. The real artistry came in shaving the upper lip, that narrow space between mouth and nose, small, curved, treacherous. One slip, and a priest might speak a sacred name with a lisp for the next 3 days. Some developed techniques involving angled mirrors, held just so by candlelight. Others shaved blind, trusting muscle memory and divine mercy. And yet, the fear never fully faded, not of beards per se, but of being seen with one, of walking past a statue and sensing somehow that the stone eyes had registered your shadowed chin, of entering a ceremony and catching the briefest pause in a fellow priest's chant. The horror of maybe, just maybe, not being smooth enough. The gods did not comment, the raven never blinked, but silence, in a temple, was rarely comfort. So the priests kept shaving, kept oiling, kept checking each other's faces by torchlight. It was not about vanity, it was about survival, in a system where hairlessness was holiness, and beards were the subtle beginning of exile. A priest walked into a temple, shaved so cleanly his skin squeaked. No one laughed, no one even acknowledged his entrance. That was the point. The silence wasn't awkward, it was sacred, a performance so deeply rehearsed, no one dared improvise. In this hallowed space, everything was a ritual, every step, a line of choreography, every glance, a well-timed cue. The Egyptian priesthood was less a religious job, and more a long-running spiritual theater production, only with more body oil and fewer ad-libs. To the modern eye, it might seem strange. These men, gliding silently through colonnades, heads reflecting the torchlight like burnished wax fruit, moving in slow unison, smelling faintly of frankincense and what can only be described as despair in liquid form. But to the ancient Egyptian, this was the ultimate act of devotion. A priest did not merely believe the world was sacred, he performed it, relentlessly, hour by hour, shaved, anointed, silent. Temples were not community centers, they were not places of public prayer, they were machines for sustaining cosmic order, intricate, moody, and almost entirely inaccessible to the average person. Ordinary Egyptians were not allowed inside, not really, the outer courtyards perhaps, but the real action, that took place deep within, behind carved doors and curtained sanctuaries, where the gods waited in the form of statues, and priests played their parts like divine stagehands who had forgotten how to speak. The silence was rehearsed, literally. Novice priests were trained not only in rituals and texts, but in posture, breathing, and movement. A poorly timed footstep could echo too loudly and disrupt the ambience. A sneeze could derail the entire performance. There are written records of rituals being restarted because someone coughed near the sacred oils. Not because the gods were offended by sinuses, but because ritual, like music, demanded precision. The garments, too, were part of the show. Linen, always white, always freshly washed, worn without embellishment. The cut was simple, the drape immaculate. Any wrinkle was a visual betrayal. And since ironing had not been invented, garments were pressed under stones and checked compulsively for creases. A priest with a rumpled hem might as well have arrived naked. And then the cosmetics. Yes, cosmetics. Not out of vanity, but necessity. The sun was brutal, the rituals were long, and a shiny bald head under midday light was both distracting and unflattering. So priests applied powdered minerals, malachite for the eyes, red ochre for the cheeks, and something akin to talc to reduce the reflective quality of their skulls. They were not trying to look attractive, they were trying to look divine, or at least not sweaty. There's a fringe theory, softly dismissed in most respectable journals, that some priests used a sort of early theatrical makeup to exaggerate their expressions during silent ceremonies. Subtle lines darkened here and there, cheekbones accentuated to make pious contemplation more legible from across a dimly lit hyperstyle hall. It sounds ridiculous, but so does shaving your kneecaps 3 times a day to impress a statue. The gods, after all, did not clap. They did not send down comment cards or divine applause. Their approval was inferred through good harvests, quiet floods, and the continued absence of plague. And so the priests performed, precisely, reverently, and always under the assumption that somewhere in the darkness something was watching. Something like the raven, perhaps. It perched above the high lintel near the incense altar, a soot-colored silhouette against the stone. Its eyes glinted, though no torchlight touched them. It did not interrupt, it did not participate, but it was always there, which in temple logic was enough to matter. The rituals were exacting, offerings placed just so, libations poured with slow, practiced tilts, statues bathed and dressed and fed with gesture, not actual food. It was theater, but also not. There was no audience, no applause, just repetition, and the creeping awareness that if one bowl was placed slightly off-center, the entire universe might take offense. Historians still argue whether the priests believed the gods actually inhabited the statues. Some say yes, the divine essence would descend during rites, inhabiting the carved forms briefly before returning to the heavens. Others argue the entire affair was symbolic, a kind of pious placebo meant to preserve social order. And a third camp insists that the priests themselves weren't always sure and preferred not to ask. Regardless, the show went on, day after day, before dawn, after sunset, the same motions, the same words, spoken with the same cadences, at the same times. One could almost imagine a priest waking in the night, dreaming of incense and placement angles, silently muttering the opening lines of the morning unwrapping rite while reaching for his razor. Performance, of course, implies rehearsal, and priests rehearsed. New initiates learned the rituals by watching older priests, copying their movements, and being corrected, not gently, and never publicly. If a novice stumbled while pouring a libation, the entire team would reset the scene and begin again, no eye contact made. It was a hierarchy of subtle discipline, no yelling, just the slow grinding pressure of centuries of expectation. The stakes were cosmic, that was the belief. If the rituals failed, if the offerings were unworthy, if the silence was too loud, or the hand gesture too wide, then the sacred balance might tip. Crops could fail, floods might not come, the sun could skip a day, or worse, come back too early and ruin the lighting design. There was little room for creativity. Innovation in temple life was not encouraged. The gods liked what they liked, and what they liked was sameness, carried out by men so clean-shaven their thoughts echoed. A priest who tried something new, say adjusting the angle of a sistrum shake for flair, was seen not as imaginative, but dangerous. And yet, somehow, this relentless pageantry became normal. The priests accepted it, even enjoyed it. Some found a kind of peace in the repetition, a rhythm in the silence. They woke, shaved, bathed, powdered and performed. No deviation, no disruption, just the long, slow ballet of belief. One priest, whose journal survived in partial form, described his routine with the phrase, "the daily unwrapping of the world." A lovely thought if you ignore the fact that he followed it by listing 6 separate ointments required for his pre-dawn ankle purification. Even rest was part of the performance. Priests rotated in shifts, not because they needed sleep, but because the temple needed to stay awake. Someone had to always be there, always ready. The gods, it was assumed, were watching at all hours, and no one wanted to be caught dozing off mid-libation. And still, above it all, the raven lingered, sometimes on a ledge, sometimes at the window slit. Once it was spotted standing on the edge of the sacred oil basin. It never made a sound, never interfered. It simply was, a symbol perhaps, or maybe just a bird that liked rituals. The silence of the temple wasn't emptiness, it was structure, a scaffolding of implied meaning, built from gesture and scent and timing. The priests moved through it, not as men, but as functionaries of a larger will. Their bodies became tools, their words instruments, their breath incense. It is difficult, from a modern perspective, to imagine such a life without conversation, without improvisation, without a single hair allowed to exist without permission. And yet it lasted for centuries. Priests came and went, gods remained, so did the rituals, so did the oil, and yes, so did the raven. At some point, one must assume the priests simply gave up on growing hair altogether, not out of choice, but from the sheer exhaustion of removing it so frequently it barely had time to consider returning. The Egyptian priesthood did not trust a single shave to last. Once per day was fine for ordinary people. But priests lived on a different calendar, a spiritual one, a stubble-free one, a schedule defined not by the sun or the Nile, but by hair regrowth. 3 times a day, morning, midday, evening. This was not optional, it was temple protocol. A performance of bodily maintenance so consistent that the gods probably assumed humans just came that way, bald by default, scented by discipline. Each session followed the same steps: wake, bathe, shave, oil, dress, repeat. There was no point in cutting corners. The gods didn't respect shortcuts, and neither did the high priest, who watched everything with the energy of a man silently judging your collarbone. Miss a spot once, and you might be reassigned to scroll duty. Miss it twice, and you might find yourself scrubbing basalt floors with a brush made of personal shame. The morning shave began in the dim light before dawn, water still cool from the night, oil cold, skin still half asleep. Priests gathered in pairs, sometimes in silence, sometimes trading careful glances that translated to, "I swear if I cut myself again, I'm offering myself to Anubis." The tools were always ready: copper blades, wooden combs, small bowls of scented unguent, and linen towels folded with unreasonable precision. The ritual began at the scalp, always the scalp. It was the most visible, the most sacred, the most prone to betrayal by a sneaky late-night follicle. Then the cheeks, the jaw, the neck, down the arms, across the chest, and finally, the less poetic regions: knees, ankles, thighs, armpits, which were apparently of great concern to the divine. The sequence was rehearsed until it became muscle memory. Shave wrong, and you risked a nick. Shave out of order, and you risked a theological imbalance. No pressure. Then came the midday shave. Less ceremonial, more maintenance. A refresh, a touch-up. The priests treated their bodies like temple floors, swept regularly, polished often. By noon, any hint of stubble had to be erased. Even if no god was being addressed directly, the possibility of divine surveillance lingered, and you did not want to be found hairy at lunchtime. The tools by this point were warm from the sun, the oil a little runnier, the mood less reverent, more resigned. No grand ritual now, just quiet efficiency. A priest might excuse himself from administrative duties or incense arrangement to disappear briefly and return 15 minutes later, shin glistening, upper lip suspiciously smoother than before. No one asked questions. Everyone understood. And finally, the evening shave, the third act, the one that came just before sunset rites, when the temple grew quiet and the air thickened with dusk and old prayers. This shave was slower, more careful. Shadows stretched across the stone floors, and the copper blades caught the last of the light. It was the most meditative of the 3 sessions, a ritual of closure. You removed what little had dared to return throughout the day. You reapplied oils. You whispered the quiet invocations. You presented yourself to the gods one last time before darkness returned. Historians still argue whether the 3-a-day rule was universal or only practiced in major temples. Some claim it was a practical adaptation to Egypt's climate, a way to prevent sweat and odor from interfering with sanctity. Others insist it was symbolic, a method of affirming control over the body in a world ruled by chaos. A few whisper with little evidence and great enthusiasm that it was simply a competition between temple cliques, the twice-a-day sect shamed into upping their game by the more ambitious thrice-a-day crowd. Regardless of origin, the result was a priesthood in a near-constant state of grooming. The amount of copper involved was staggering. Entire industries existed to produce razors, sharpen blades, and smelt replacements for priests who shaved with the fury of a man trying to outrun his own biology. There are temples with stockpiles of broken razors, small, battered things, worn down from years of scraping. Some bear marks of sharpening, others appear almost translucent with overuse. And yet, the practice continued. No priest ever seems to have rebelled. There is no record of a mustached heretic storming out of the temple, declaring independence from the tyranny of personal maintenance. They all shaved, they all complied, either out of devotion or out of the quiet understanding that a single hair could undo a month's worth of purity. The raven, for its part, seemed unmoved. It perched on the outer ledge near the purification basins, feathers slightly ruffled by the breeze. It watched the priests as they filed in, stripped down, shaved, and re-emerged slightly glossier than before. Whether it was amused or unimpressed remains unclear. But it never left. It had found the one place in Egypt where daily monotony was sacred. There's a fringe belief that priests, through years of repeated shaving, simply stopped growing hair, that their bodies, wearied by decades of blade and oil, gave up. This is unlikely. More probable is that the regrowth became finer, less noticeable, easier to manage, but the priests never relaxed. Even the faintest fuzz was considered unacceptable. If it could be felt, it had to be removed. If it could be imagined, it had to be scoured. Some priests timed their entire day around shaving sessions. Meals were scheduled accordingly. Rituals adjusted. One temple record suggests that a priest once delayed a minor ceremony by 20 minutes because his ankle hair had returned in earnest. No one objected. It was understood. The gods would wait, but they would not forgive a bristly ankle. And yes, there were mishaps, nicks, cuts, infections. Occasionally, a priest would shave too quickly and enter the sanctuary with a thin line of blood visible on his neck. This was not a scandal, but it was enough to prompt a discreet removal and a firm reminder that sacred service required both speed and precision. Cleanliness, after all, loses something when accompanied by an open wound. One record describes a priest who attempted a dry shave to save time. No oil, no water, just blade and bravado. The result was memorable. He was removed from service for a week, not as punishment, but because his face resembled a poorly maintained papyrus scroll. He was given extra oils, a stern look, and a pamphlet on appropriate hydration, or whatever the ancient equivalent was. The daily shaving routine was exhausting, but it was also empowering. A priest, through sheer persistence, could achieve a state of near unnatural smoothness, a kind of sacred sheen. Tourists, if they had been allowed in, might have assumed the priests were made of alabaster, or perhaps born without pores, and that was the goal, to erase the line between human and holy, to sculpt the body into something the gods might recognize as one of their own. By the time the final shave of the day was complete, the priest had become something else, not mortal, not divine, something in between, a being suspended in ritual, bound by repetition, shaped by the blade. And always, nearby, the raven, the only creature in the temple not required to shave. It blinked once, before the blade touched skin, before the oil was warmed, before the priest even dared to glance at his sacred razor. There was water, cold, not by design but by tradition. Ritual baths were not spa experiences, they were obligations, frigid, echoing, splash-heavy obligations, and in the ancient Egyptian temple, no one reached for divinity without first stepping barefoot into a shallow stone basin that smelled faintly of lilies, limestone, and regret. Bathing was the start of everything. Morning rites, purification ceremonies, statue awakenings, even the occasional papyrus inventory, none began until the priest had submerged, poured, or otherwise soaked his body in water, drawn from approved sources. Not just any puddle would do. The Nile was common, yes, but it had to be upstream, free of fishy interruptions and particularly devoid of crocodiles. There were designated channels, blessed troughs, carefully maintained cisterns with water so still it could double as a mirror, one, naturally judged by its ability to reflect your hairlessness. The process was methodical, a linen cloth, a bowl of water, maybe two if someone had earned extra merit or spilled wine on themselves the night before. Priests began at the crown of the head. Water was poured slowly, deliberately, not to cleanse but to symbolically awaken the body. The body, one must remember, was not their own. It belonged to the temple, and like any temple surface, it had to be rinsed before use. The bath was silent. Everything was. No splashing, no chatter, certainly no sighs of relief. If you enjoyed it, you kept that to yourself. Sound distracted from the seriousness of the rite. One historian described the priestly bath as a quiet drowning of one's ego. That historian later revised the phrase after being reminded that no, the priests were not actually drowning, just chilling slightly. After the first pour came the scrub, not with soap. Soap was a luxury of later, greasier times, but with mineral sand or natron. Yes, the same stuff used for mummification. It was coarse, slightly abrasive, ideal for removing physical impurities, metaphysical residue, and possibly the top layer of your patience. The scrubbing was brief but thorough. You were not polishing yourself, you were preparing the surface of a sacred object. Fringe beliefs emerged here too. One temple text suggested that if a priest did not rinse the soles of his feet last, he would bring yesterday's sins into today's prayers. Another, found scribbled in the margin of a purification scroll, warns that unwashed elbows could misalign the judgment of Mart. Whether metaphor or cautionary tale, elbows were never neglected again. The floors were cold, always. Stone does not warm for anyone, especially not when it's perpetually wet from generations of nervous bathers. Priests walked carefully, toes gripping for traction, attempting not to slip and fracture their dignity in front of a statue. It happened. There were no lawsuits, only muttered apologies and perhaps an extra round of natron. And the raven watched, perched on a lintel where no water reached. It observed with the stillness of an idol. Its feathers were dry, its judgment implied. Some temples had entire purification wings, narrow corridors lined with basins, sluices carved into the stone to direct runoff, small alcoves with jars of oil, stacks of linen cloths, and not a single towel that could be described as fluffy. The idea was not comfort, the idea was transformation. Priests emerged from these rooms glistening, raw-skinned, slightly hunched, and very, very ready to begin another day of not being human. The ritual bathing occurred multiple times a day, typically before each major shave. This meant at least 3 full submersions daily, one in the early morning, one before the midday rites, and one again just before sunset. And should an unclean event occur, an insect bite, a sneeze in the wrong direction, a drop of oil misplaced on the wrong part of the linen robe, a 4th bath might be required, possibly 5th if the gods were feeling sensitive. There is a record of a priest who, upon accidentally stepping in temple ash, requested immediate repurification. His colleagues tried to reassure him that it was minor, but he insisted. He bathed twice, then shaved again, then returned to the sanctuary, only to realize he had left his incense dish in the wrong spot. He was later found bathing a 3rd time. No one stopped him. Devotion is devotion, even when it's wet and redundant. Historians still argue over the origin of these washing rituals. Some say it stems from early desert survival practices, when water was precious and thus sacred. Others point to a cultural obsession with order washing as a literal manifestation of removing chaos. Still others note the proximity of bathing to mummification practices, suggesting a link between the living priest and the well-prepared corpse, an unsettling connection, but not an illogical one. In either case, the consensus is clear. Cleanliness was not next to godliness, it was godliness. Bathing was also hierarchical. The high priest, known sometimes as servant of the god, had a separate basin, slightly larger, slightly warmer, not out of indulgence but because his duties involved more sacred proximity and his mistakes carried more cosmic weight. If he tripped, a constellation might wobble. For younger priests, the purification chamber was a place of both fear and ambition. Here they were watched, not scolded, just observed. Their timing, their silence, their ability to pour water from the left shoulder to the right without splashing. Every move was recorded mentally by someone whose job title might as well have been passive-aggressive, observant, elder. One fringe belief held that if a priest bathed properly for 100 days in a row without error, he would gain a sort of spiritual immunity. No need for oils, no fear of lice, no threat from sweat. The belief, charming as it was, rarely made it past day 27, at which point someone inevitably sneezed during the foot rinse. And yet, despite the discomfort, the repetition, the slipping, the scouring, the bathing remained. No priest considered skipping it, not because of rulebooks, not because of fear, but because the temple was a living machine, and each bath was a turning cog. If you did not bathe, someone else might fail. If someone else failed, the balance might tip. If the balance tipped, well, the raven might blink, and no one wanted that. There were moments of beauty, the light reflecting off wet stone, the scent of oils warming in clay pots, the soft rhythm of water poured in silence. In those moments, the bath stopped feeling like an obligation. It became a connection between priest and purpose, between flesh and stone, between the unbearable heat of midday and the cold floor beneath your feet. And always, after the final rinse, came the dry linen cloth, coarse, unforgiving, but dependable. The priest dried himself with care, starting from the head and working down, careful not to leave a single drop to stain the linen robe. Then came the oil, the blade, and the return to duty. Above, as always, the raven remained, untouched by water, unshaved, but undeniably present. Among all the crevices, corners, and regrettable angles on the human body, the armpit holds a special place in the Egyptian priesthood's long list of things that must never, ever be trusted. It was soft, it was hidden, it was humid, and most damning of all, it was asymmetrical. In a culture obsessed with divine balance and hairless geometry, the underarm was a structural betrayal. The ancient priests were not unaware of this flaw. They simply pretended the armpit did not exist, except when it absolutely had to be confronted, and when it was, the confrontation was brutal, deliberate, and performed with the urgency of someone trying to shave a sin off their ribcage before the gods noticed. Hair, of course, was not allowed anywhere, but underarm hair carried a specific shame. It wasn't just a grooming failure, it was a spiritual oversight. The armpit was where sweat collected, where heat lingered, where chaos gathered in microscopic beads. A missed patch under the arm wasn't just a cosmetic issue, it was a theological loophole. The body could not be impure where the eyes of the gods did not directly gaze. So the priests made sure to be smooth everywhere, especially in the places no one wanted to talk about. And yet the design of the human shoulder does not lend itself to easy scraping. A priest, copper blade in hand, would hoist his arm above his head, attempting to flatten out the folds and create a workable shaving surface. This inevitably led to awkward contortions, nervous squinting, and the occasional temple servant being asked to hand over an oil pot with one hand while politely pretending not to stare at the other. It was not glamorous work, but it was necessary. Ritual texts are strangely quiet on the topic of armpits. They mention purification of all extremities and that which lies beneath the garment, but nowhere does any official scroll admit outright that priests spent large parts of their day anxiously shaving their underarms. This absence, scholars agree, is either a symptom of collective embarrassment or a practical acknowledgement that some things were simply too awkward to preserve for eternity. Yet there are clues. Statues depict priests in poses of raised arms, often interpreted as praise or offering, but the angle, the precise measured angle, suggests something else, shaving perhaps, or at least checking, and there are fragments of daily duty scrolls, badly damaged, that include references to attention beneath the limbs and ensuring balance in hidden places, which, in bureaucratic temple language, may as well have said, check your pits. The tools were no help. Copper razors, flat and uncooperative, had to be wielded at strange angles with a combination of faith and muscle memory. A priest attempting a full underarm shave might go through multiple passes, each one a test of steadiness. There were no mirrors for this task at best, a polished metal disc that turned every attempt into a distorted guessing game. Occasionally, priests asked for help, quietly, discreetly, from trusted peers who had seen worse. One fringe theory insists that some temples employed specialized purification assistants for difficult angles. These assistants, selected for their discretion and steadiness, would be called only in moments of dire geometry, an outstretched elbow, a trembling blade, a whispered "brother, I cannot reach." This was not a position of shame, but of subtle prestige. Only the most trusted were allowed near another priest's underarms. The oils made things both easier and worse. On one hand, they softened the hair. On the other, they made everything slippery. A single misplaced drop, and the blade might slip, not enough to injure, though that happened too, but enough to remove skin that had already been purified twice that day, and so came the powders, chalky, herbal, drying agents applied after the shave to counteract sweat and oil. Their smell was somewhere between mint and funeral incense. Their texture, aggressively gritty. Historians still debate how much time was spent on underarm care. Estimates vary wildly, from 5 minutes a day to entire afternoon sessions. Some believe the focus was less about quantity and more about timing. The final underarm shave, they suggest, came immediately before entering the sanctuary. That way there was no chance for regrowth to undermine the ceremony. Others propose it was done midday, just after the meal, when the body was most vulnerable to mortal odors. And yes, meals factored in. Certain foods were forbidden, not just for their impurity, but for their effect on smell. Onions, garlic, leeks, all banned or heavily restricted. Because if a priest raised his arm during a ritual and the scent of last night's lentil stew drifted toward the god statue, well, no one wanted to explain that to Osiris. There is one infamous tale, half joking, half historical, about a priest who fainted during the midwinter solstice rite, not from fasting or overexertion, but from holding his arm aloft for too long after a rushed underarm shave. He had cut too deep, bled slightly, applied too much oil to compensate, and then slipped while lighting incense. His colleagues said nothing. They simply dragged him out by his ankles and resumed the chant. The ritual continued as always, but the memory lingered. Overhead, the raven had watched the entire incident. It blinked once. The armpit came to symbolize something more than just a grooming challenge. It was the ultimate hidden flaw, the part of the body that resisted divine order, that needed constant surveillance. In a way, it was the priesthood in miniature, human effort battling inevitability. Every day the armpit reminded the priest that no matter how clean, how shaved, how prepared he might be, he was still mortal, still messy, still trying. Fringe beliefs crystallized around this idea. One minor sect even developed an invocation specifically for the armpit, spoken in near whispers before evening rites. Let the shadow beneath bear no stain. Let no curl defy the oil. It was poetic, unofficial, and probably muttered by every priest at some point, usually while leaning over a wash basin and cursing the gods for their anatomical humor. Occasionally, the discipline cracked. A priest might skip a shave. Just one, just to see, just for the comfort of not risking a slice under the arm before breakfast. And almost immediately he would feel it, the guilt, the knowledge, the invisible itch of impurity crawling into the fold. Whether anyone else noticed didn't matter. He knew, and that was enough to drive him back to the blade within hours. Temple rumors claimed that unshaven armpits caused rituals to fail, that gods turned away, that incense burned unevenly, that the sacred bread rose too fast or crumbled unexpectedly. None of this was proven, but in a system where ritual was everything, suspicion was reason enough. Better to endure the daily scrape than risk divine irritation. Priests began to develop quiet tricks, double-handed methods, elbow props, carefully folded linen pads used for counterbalance. A few even sharpened their blades differently, customizing the angle to better suit underarm topography. It was part science, part desperation. One priest carved a groove into his razor to help track where he had already shaved. His peers called it the map of purity. He insisted it worked. No one argued. In temple storage rooms, jars of underarm powder sat next to incense, ointments, and offering bread. Their labels were vague: purifying dust, sacred dryness, but everyone knew what they were for. And when the jars ran low, panic set in. An emergency delivery once delayed a ceremony by nearly an hour, as priests waited for someone to fetch more from the adjacent temple. The wait was silent, tense, oily, and through it all, the raven remained. Still, present, as if to say, I have no underarms, and yet, I judge you. It would be easy to laugh at all this, to see it as excessive, absurd, a desperate attempt to impose order on a part of the body that simply refuses to cooperate. But that would miss the point. The priests were not trying to be perfect, they were trying to be worthy. The armpit, for all its difficulty, was part of the path. To shave it was to accept that holiness is inconvenient, that sacredness is sweaty, that devotion means checking even the parts no one sees, because the gods might, or because you might. And so the razors kept gliding, the oils kept seeping, the powders clumped, the elbow locked, the skin tingled, and the priest, freshly shaved, stepped once more into the temple, hairless, hopeful, and slightly itchy. Above, as always, the raven said nothing. In the stillness of an Egyptian sanctuary, beneath columns carved with prayers and ceilings painted like distant skies, a priest might pause not to pray, but to powder. This was not vanity, this was not indulgence, this was protocol. His skin, stripped smooth by countless razors and several lifetimes' worth of ablutions, had to be tended with great care. The gods, after all, did not want their servants crusty. Cosmetic consecration, as it might be termed by a bored modern academic, was a daily ritual after bathing and shaving, and just before oiling, priests applied a variety of powders, salves, and pigments to their freshly scrubbed skin. These were not meant to beautify, they were meant to preserve, against sun, against insects, against dryness, against most of all the creeping humanity that lurked just beneath the dermis. Priests did not wear makeup in the modern sense. There were no eyeliner tutorials scrawled in hieroglyphs, but they did wear kohl, the dark mineral pigment applied around the eyes to reduce glare and possibly discourage evil spirits from sneaking in through one's corneas. In a land where the sun could fry an offering tray by midday, such practical concerns were spiritually reframed. You wore kohl, not to protect your vision, but to reflect the divine light without catching fire. The kohl was applied with wooden or ivory sticks, dipped in small ceramic pots. The line had to be smooth, clean, no smudging, no streaks. The goal was clarity. The gods, apparently, liked their priests looking mildly concerned and vaguely owlish. Other pigments were also used, red ochre for cheeks, again not to feign youth or vitality, but to simulate the blush of spiritual attentiveness. A flushed priest was an alert priest, or at least one who hadn't fallen asleep during incense distribution. Malachite was ground into a pale green powder, sometimes brushed across the temples or jawline, depending on the rite. These weren't fashion choices, they were spiritual pigments. Or, depending on one's tolerance for sacred nonsense, extremely high-pressure stage makeup. Then came the ointments. There were ointments for before the ceremony, ointments for after, ointments for if you'd had a difficult morning with the blade and needed something to soothe both your skin and your self-respect. Common ingredients included animal fat, beeswax, myrrh resin, cedarwood oil, and sometimes crushed lotus. The smell was overpowering. A priest who had fully prepared himself for a major ritual could be detected from 2 corridors away. And still, the oils came. They were poured over the skin, rubbed in carefully, smoothed along the limbs like lacquer on a statue. It was not just skincare, it was theological preparation. You were turning your body into something other than human, something polished, something sacred, something slightly slippery. Historians still argue whether this elaborate cosmetic routine had any functional purpose beyond symbolism. Some suggest it helped repel insects, others point to the dry climate and the need for moisture retention. Still others, charmingly skeptical, claim it was merely one more absurd extension of Egypt's religion as performance model. If you're going to pretend to be divine, one scholar writes, you might as well moisturize like it. Fringe beliefs attached themselves to these preparations like flies to honey-scented balm. One claimed that certain oils, when applied in the correct sequence, allowed the priest's voice to travel more smoothly to the ears of the gods. Another insisted that a misapplied cheek pigment could distort prayer frequencies. Neither theory has held up under papyrological scrutiny, but the fact that anyone felt the need to write them down says something about just how seriously all of this was taken. There is even a record of a temple dispute, minor, politely worded but unmistakably testy, between 2 priests over the correct ratio of frankincense to cinnamon oil in the anointment blend. The scroll ends with an unsatisfying compromise, and what appears to be a shared fine of 1 linen strip each. Harmony, even when fragrant, required sacrifice. Cosmetic preparation wasn't always private. In larger temples there were communal oiling spaces, quiet alcoves where priests stood in rows, each smoothing ointment into limbs and cheeks, eyes closed in something between meditation and resignation. It was a ballet of baldness, choreographed not by joy but by obligation. No one smiled, everyone glistened. Some priests excelled at it. Their limbs always gleamed just right. Their coal never ran, even in the midday heat. They developed reputations. He who glows, one was called, another, the smooth of arm. These were not insults, they were signs of spiritual diligence. If your elbow looked dry, your soul probably was too. Overhead, the raven watched. Its feathers required no ointment. Its eyes needed no coal. It blinked rarely and never commented, but its presence, as always, was undeniable, somewhere between mascot and metaphysical bystander. Cosmetic failure had consequences. A blotchy patch of malachite might not cost you your place in the ceremony, but it would earn you glances, not harsh ones, just long, unblinking, judgmental in the way only a fellow priest's silence can be. One novice learned this the hard way after misapplying pigment in a rush. His cheeks turned an unfortunate greenish brown. No one said anything, but he was reassigned to candle trimming for a week. It wasn't about appearance, it was about consistency. The gods did not demand beauty, they demanded symmetry, balance, smooth surfaces, predictable outlines. A priest who looked unpredictable, who flaked, who glistened irregularly, who shimmered when he should have glowed, was a disruption. And the priests knew this, which is why many of them developed personal blends, recipes passed from mentor to novice, slight adjustments for skin type, climate, or divine temperament. Some swore by more beeswax, others preferred more myrrh. One eccentric blend used powdered fish scale for shine. Its user was deeply unpopular with cats. There's a fragment of a personal journal, rare, battered, half-burned, that includes the line, "Today I tried the cedar rose mix again. The scent lingers too long, the statue sneezed. It is likely a joke, or a metaphor, or an ancient version of a product review." And then there's the matter of baldness, not the result of shaving, but the permanent kind. Priests who had served for decades, whose skin had long since given up trying to regenerate hair, often found themselves with a kind of unsettling sheen. Their heads reflected light like polished alabaster. Their limbs bore the soft translucence of overused oil. They were walking icons of sacred dermal discipline. If anyone deserved divine attention, it was them. Or perhaps just a long nap in the shade. There is a legend, half fact, half temple gossip, about a priest whose skin became so reflective he was asked to stand outside the sanctuary during midday rites, lest he distract the god's statue. He complied, he was proud. He later invented a powder blend that reduced glare. The temple called it blessed dust. It was not widely adopted. And still, every day, the routine returned. Bath, shave, oil, powder, paint, layer after layer, like preparing a statue for unveiling. The body became an icon. The icon became a symbol. The symbol was oiled, powdered, and presented in silence to a god who may or may not have cared, but who by custom was expected to appreciate effort. Even the air changed. The smell of 10 oiled priests in a small stone chamber was unforgettable. Sweet, herbal, slightly overwhelming, like walking into a florist's shop that had recently caught fire. The scent clung to robes, to scrolls, to stone. It was part of the temple itself. Tourists, had they been allowed inside, would have described it as spiritually moisturizing. And in the background, the raven remained. It did not glow, it did not glisten, but it watched, with the same neutral patience it gave to all things. Priests came and went, powders changed, ointments evolved, but the bird stayed, unimpressed. Because cosmetics in the temple were not a luxury, they were a language. Every line of coal, every drop of oil, every fragrant smear across the chest said something. I am clean, I am ready, I have scrubbed, shaved, and glowed for this, and the gods, silent though they were, received the message. In the towering stillness of an Egyptian temple, where incense rose in careful spirals and the chants echoed like slow water against limestone, there was one sound that absolutely could not be tolerated, the unmistakable betrayal of a digestive system under duress. Priests were expected to maintain silence, stillness, composure, every movement measured, every breath a whisper. Their voices chanted in unison, their feet padded across polished floors without sound, and even their thoughts, one suspects, were required to think quietly. But the body, bless it, had opinions, and the human digestive tract, even when sanctified with oil and devotion, occasionally had something to say. This was a problem. The priestly diet was designed with ritual purity in mind. Lots of bread, fruits, vegetables, and water filtered through linen cloths. Meat was rare and only in specific ceremonial contexts. Onions and garlic, those known disruptors of sacred breath, were mostly avoided, but no amount of culinary caution could eliminate the occasional gaseous indiscretion. And in a temple where one's shaved skin gleamed, and even the raven knew better than to blink too loudly, flatulence was a theological emergency. There are no direct references to this in surviving temple scrolls. Naturally, ancient Egyptian bureaucrats, for all their exhaustive record-keeping, had limits to their dignity, but the evidence exists in the margins. Literally, a damaged training scroll for novice priests includes the curious phrase, "If the silence breaks from within, be still and remain as stone." Another, preserved in the back of an ointment manual, reads, "Do not flee the chamber. The gods are forgiving, if not the high priest." Historians still argue whether such incidents were common or merely feared. Some point to dietary records showing occasional over-reliance on lentils and figs, two ingredients well known to spark mischief below the ribs. Others insist that trained priests simply learned better control, that through discipline, meditation, and strategic clenching, they achieved a bodily stillness most modern yogis can only dream of. The debate is ongoing. A fringe belief held that the gods could smell impurity, not metaphorically, literally, that divine statues, though unmoving, were capable of detecting and judging scent. This idea led to the widespread use of scented oils not just on the skin, but occasionally on the linen wrappings of the lower body, forming what was essentially an ancient attempt at deodorized underwear. It was not always successful. There is a temple anecdote, probably apocryphal, about a young priest assigned to incense duty who lost control mid-procession. The timing was unfortunate. The sound was audible. The high priest paused. The chant faltered. One of the temple cats darted beneath the altar. The incident was never formally acknowledged, but the novice was reassigned to scribe work for 3 lunar cycles and never again allowed near a flame. And still, the raven observed. The bird did not flinch, did not flap. It simply adjusted its perch, as though to suggest that airborne disturbances were beneath its notice. Feathers, it implied, can handle anything. Priests developed strategies. Small coughs timed for cover. Throat clearings issued with theatrical purpose. A sudden, excessive interest in incense burners, which when nudged with enthusiasm could produce forgiving hisses. One scroll fragment, annotated in a novice's hand, includes a doodle of a priest with musical notes emanating from his rear, quickly scratched out and replaced with "Practice silence harder." Dietary remedies were tried. Fennel, mint, coriander, anything to soothe the stomach. Tea-like infusions were brewed and consumed in quiet desperation. Ritual baths were sometimes extended, partly for purification, partly in the hope that immersion might reset a traitorous colon. There's a documented recipe for wind-soothing paste, involving crushed dates and barley soaked in wine. Its effectiveness remains unverified. The body, of course, did not always cooperate, and so in the rarest cases, failure occurred. Most such incidents were handled with what scholars call ritual denial. If no one acknowledged it, it did not happen. Eyes forward, lips sealed, only the faintest tightening of the jaw or the blink of a temple scribe might betray the disturbance. The gods, one hoped, had a sense of humor, or at least poor acoustics. One statue, discovered in a temple annex, depicts a priest bent slightly at the waist, one hand pressed behind him, the other raised in blessing, at first assumed to be a depiction of healing or humility. Further analysis of the accompanying inscription, "He who halts what should not flow," suggests otherwise. The debate among art historians continues, punctuated by sighs. The tension between divine decorum and digestive honesty shaped more than behavior, it shaped posture. Priests stood with legs slightly apart, not in readiness but in balance, knees soft, spine erect, core engaged, not for martial purpose but to quietly suppress rebellion. This was not yoga, it was survival. Even in ritual dances, slow ceremonial movements performed during major festivals, the choreography avoided jumps, twists, or sudden compressions. Every step was designed for elegance and discretion. A single slip could turn sacred art into comic relief, and nobody wanted to be remembered as the one who ruined the festival of sedge and bee. Scholars propose that the elaborate perfume use among priests may have served dual purposes. Yes, fragrance was divine. Yes, oils signified purity, but in a temple filled with human beings and tightly sealed chambers, scented redundancy was likely a practical buffer. Multiple layers of myrrh, frankincense, and lotus may not have erased accidents, but they helped blur the edges, and the silence, always the silence, remained sacred. Silence in the temple was more than an absence of speech. It was a kind of posture, a spiritual shape. To make noise, to grunt, to sigh, to shift audibly was to risk disrupting the conversation between mortal and divine, and so priests became still, so still that the slightest involuntary sound felt like thunder or treason. There is a theory, charming but unprovable, that temple floors were intentionally designed to creak slightly, not enough to disturb, but just enough to cover small personal sounds. The spacing of the flagstones, the choice of foundation timber, carefully calculated to produce a soft groan when stepped upon. If true, this would make Egyptian temple design the earliest known form of sonic plausible deniability. And once more, the raven perched, unmoved. No sound from the bird, no judgment, just that steady, impassive gaze, perhaps amused, perhaps baffled, or perhaps just waiting for the next priest to shuffle nervously and pretend he had dropped a feather. What remains astonishing is not that accidents happened, but that so few records mention them. In a society that documented offerings, sun angles, grain inventories, and dream interpretations, the absence of temple mishaps is either a grand cover-up or the result of a priestly tradition so strong, so disciplined, that even embarrassment feared to take root. Or maybe they simply accepted it. Maybe a priest, having done everything right, shaved, bathed, powdered, oiled, fasted, prayed, felt a rumble in his gut, and in that moment understood that even within sacred walls the body was a reminder of limits, of humility, of breath and noise and awkward truth, and that the gods who watched from stone eyes and golden thrones might forgive the occasional mortal misfire. As long as the ritual continued, as long as the offerings were pure, as long as no one laughed. And so they did not laugh. They stood, they swayed, they sang, they prayed, and in their silence they made room for the imperfection that proved they were human. Dressing, for the Egyptian priest, was not a task. It was a ceremony, a ritual after the ritual, a post-purification, post-oil, post-powder event that involved folding, draping, tucking, and tying with such meticulous care that it occasionally took longer than the actual service. Linen was the fabric of choice, not because it was comfortable, though it could be, provided it was not starched to the consistency of architectural parchment, but because it was pure. Cotton was unknown. Wool was from animals. Silk was a suspicious foreign whisper. But linen was born from the flax plant, and the flax plant never made a sound, never blinked, never sinned. And so the priests swaddled themselves in it, layer upon whispering layer, thin gauze over thick wrap, tunics under aprons, sashes crossing over belts which crossed over other sashes, some purely decorative, others so essential they held the entire outfit and a priest's dignity together. It began with the inner wrap, soft, close to the skin, often bleached, sometimes scented. Then came the overwrap, slightly more formal, sometimes embroidered with temple-specific symbols, ankh here, lotus there, occasional speculative goose, then the girdle, then the outer robe, then, if the ritual demanded it, a ceremonial scarf long enough to reach from shoulder to ankle and still double as a windsock if necessary. Some priests wore their linen in what scholars now call the standard spiral, a single continuous strip, wrapped in an ascending spiral from waist to armpit. Others favored the layered slab, which was essentially a rectangular sheet folded and refolded until it resembled both a robe and a tablecloth on the verge of slipping. There was no standard uniform across all temples, of course. Some favored simplicity. Others turned dressing into something closer to competitive origami. A few temples reportedly had internal hierarchies based on the sharpness of pleats. A straight crease could earn you nods. A misaligned tuck might see you bumped to incense stirring until you relearned geometry. The raven naturally wore none of it, and yet it observed from the lintel beam with the detached superiority of someone who knew that fashion was, at best, ornamental obedience. Historians still argue whether the elaborate wrapping had hidden meanings. Some claim the number of layers corresponded to stages of cosmic awareness. Others say it was entirely pragmatic. More layers meant more protection against both sun and scrutiny. A few propose that priests layered their linen as insulation against unpredictable divine moods, like theological armor. If Ra is angry today, the reasoning went, at least I will sweat in symmetry. Fringe beliefs nested themselves in the folds. One scroll fragment from a rural temple suggests that wrapping the sash counterclockwise attracted misfortune. Another claimed that wearing two girdles created interference in divine reception. A particularly superstitious novice once refused to dress in even-numbered layers, insisting that odd layers echoed the sacred rhythms of Mart. He was gently assigned to tomb inventory and never promoted. Temple storerooms overflowed with linen. Shelves groaned beneath neatly folded stacks. Scribes tracked each robe's usage, number of wearings, length of sun exposure, degree of sanctity absorption. One robe used during a particularly powerful solar rite was marked with the phrase, "Do not wash," may still radiate. No one touched it for years. Dressing rooms were quiet chaos, robed figures moving like ghosts in slow motion, whispered questions about belt length, small panic over a missing girdle, the occasional snap of linen torn by accident, followed by a priest silently unwrapping himself like a disappointed scroll and starting over. Priests dressed each other only in extreme emergencies. Modesty and pride forbade most collaborative wrapping, but every now and then, a tangled sash or upside-down apron prompted quiet intervention. No one spoke, they just stepped forward, tugged the fold, re-wrapped the edge, and stepped back. It was a sacred intimacy, the kind built not on affection but on mutual terror of divine judgment. Dressing mistakes could be subtle, a robe too short, exposing too much ankle, a sash riding too high, suggesting nervousness, a girdle off-center, hinting at spiritual imbalance. One priest famously entered a ceremony with his tunic inverted. He did not notice until a colleague pointed out that the embroidered lotus was growing downward. The priest spent the next 3 weeks cleaning ritual basins, reflecting, one assumes, on botanical alignment. There were rules about laundering. Linen had to be washed in special basins, dried in the shade, folded with prayer. Reused linen was acceptable only if it had not absorbed impurity. Stained linen was burned, or, in less zealous temples, given to statue attendants who used it as dust cloths, carefully, respectfully, and only after muttering a short disclaimer to the nearest god. Some senior priests had attendants, not servants, never that, but aides who helped lay out garments, maintain pleats and track which layer went on first during high festivals. These aides were trusted implicitly, often promoted from the ranks of scribe or candle trimmer. Their job was not to judge but to remember that on the Feast of Eternal Clarity, the left side sash was to be tied after the third chant, not before. The raven, to its credit, never interfered, but once, according to a badly translated account, a priest tripped on his own overlong outer wrap while ascending the sanctuary steps. As he sprawled across the alabaster floor, a flutter from the rafters revealed a single feather drifting down. The symbolism was unclear, but the timing was exquisite. Linen, of course, had its limits. In summer, it became a sauna. In winter, a sieve. Its transparency varied wildly, leading to disputes about appropriate layering. One temple had to revise its dress code after a midday sunbeam exposed more than one priest's spiritual outline. The adjustment: 2 layers minimum, 3 if windy. No fasteners were used, no buttons, no pins, no clever ties, just folds, weighted tucks, strategic pressure. The entire outfit held together by friction and prayer, which meant that one poorly timed sneeze could unravel a sleeve, one misstep during a chant, and you risked a cascade failure of theological cloth origami. And yet, somehow, it worked. Priests walked, they moved, they bowed, they offered incense. recited hymns, rang bells, and their linen held. Mostly, and when it did not, they recovered with the grace of those who had trained for the worst. A flapping edge was adjusted mid-turn, a slipping sash retightened during a hymn. To be a priest was to be a tailor of silence. The most famous robe, never worn, still rests in a museum in Cairo. It is 7 layers thick, embroidered with gold thread, hemmed with crushed lapis pigment. The record claims it was woven by one priest over 17 years, entirely during fasting hours. He died the day before it was scheduled for use. His fellow priests, uncertain whether this was divine approval or cosmic sarcasm, chose never to wear it. Instead, they folded it one final time, placed it in a chest, and whispered a prayer for the one who tried too hard. The raven was not consulted, but it would have approved, perhaps. Linen needs no feathers, just patience and a good fold. The floor of a temple was not like any other floor. It was cooler, for one thing, hewn from polished stone, swept hourly, and occasionally anointed with sacred oils when the festival calendar became particularly ambitious. It also had memory, or so the priests believed. Every step, every shuffle, every slight weight shift during a chant might echo, however subtly, into the ears of the gods, which meant that walking, just walking, had to be performed with the same spiritual caution as offering a loaf of bread to a falcon-headed statue who never blinked. This made shoes a subject of debate. Most people assume Egyptian priests were always barefoot. It is, after all, how they are often depicted, gliding along alabaster corridors, soles exposed, toes aligned with eternity. And in many cases, this was true. Shoes were a symbol of the outside world. They collected dust, dirt, regret. To wear them in a sanctuary was to bring in echoes of marketplaces, goat pens, and arguments about lentil prices. In short, unacceptable. And yet, priests did wear shoes, sometimes, in certain rituals, with conditions. The type of shoe varied by temple, region, and the particular neuroses of the high priest in charge. Some allowed thin sandals made of papyrus reeds, nearly weightless, designed not to protect the foot, but to create the illusion of modest separation from the earth. Others permitted leather thongs, the straps dyed with crushed lotus or symbolic pigments that faded after 3 washings. A few elite sanctuaries even had ceremonial slippers made from linen layered so many times they could fold under their own humility. Historians still argue whether these shoes were considered extensions of purity or protective barriers against it. One camp claims that shoes were blessed objects, required to preserve the priest's own sanctity from the temple's overwhelming holiness. Another insists the opposite, that shoes protected the temple from the untrustworthy anatomy of human feet. Either way, everyone agrees shoes were not to be worn casually, not even by mistake. A fringe belief emerged in one desert region that shoes should be worn only during rain. As rain was rare, this was mostly a theoretical exercise, but the doctrine spread briefly. Priests kept sandals hidden behind altars just in case the heavens hiccuped. Some even wore foot coverings embroidered with the phrase, "in case of divine moisture." The preparation of shoes was its own ceremony. Sandals were never tied in haste. The loops were adjusted with care, sometimes while muttering quiet invocations to the gods of travel. Not that the priest was going anywhere, they just needed to move from one side of the sanctuary to the other without inviting cosmic misalignment. One scroll includes the instruction, ensure that the strap lies flat, lest the gods perceive arrogance, which is, as footwear advice goes, fairly dramatic. Even the shape of the foot mattered. Wide feet required special straps. Long toes were sometimes wrapped in linen to prevent individualism. One temple document, too fragile for display, describes a sandal design that included individual toe coverings, 5 per foot, stitched together like devotional mittens. No illustrations survive, which is probably for the best. The raven, as usual, wore no shoes. It watched from its perch as the priests padded solemnly, barefoot or nearly barefoot, along the cold floor. Its talons clicked once, just enough to remind everyone that it had never needed permission to enter a sacred space, and certainly never asked what kind of sandal was allowed. Silence accompanied each step. Shoes, when worn, could not squeak. They could not flap or slap. or cause the priest to skid across the floor like a sanctified cabbage. Special soles were tested for sound. Some temples used textured mats in high traffic areas. Others trained their priests to lift and place their feet so gently it resembled floating. A priest who shuffled was corrected. A priest who stomped was reassigned to reed collecting until he remembered how to tiptoe for eternity. There is an amusing, barely legible margin note in one priest's diary. "Today I forgot the left sandal, entered with one foot prepared and the other sinful, felt imbalance in every step. The statue looked disappointed. I apologized. It is unclear whether this is a metaphor or just an honest recounting of a rough morning." Foot washing, of course, preceded any footwear decision. Basins carved from alabaster or limestone lined the dressing chambers. Water infused with crushed petals or herbs helped neutralize scent. Some temples had designated foot washers, junior attendants whose entire job was to ensure no rogue sandal entered the holy space with a dusty heel. These attendants were respected, if not envied. A single misstep could ruin a ritual. Once, a priest in Memphis reportedly tripped over his own sandal thong mid-offering. He did not fall, but his sway was witnessed by several others, and the high priest declared the entire rite invalidated by an unstable soul. The phrase was later etched into temple stone, probably as a joke, though no one ever admitted it. Other temples banned shoes outright. Priests there trained their feet against hot stone and sharp sand. Calluses were considered badges of honor, physical proof of dedication. The soles of their feet grew thick and dark, patterned by years of silent walking over sacred geometry. One scroll suggests that some believed such calluses, when pressed into clay, left divine impressions. Shoes worn outside the temple were another matter. These were practical, leather or woven reeds patched and repaired, but they were removed the moment the sanctuary door appeared. The act of unshoeing was itself part of the transformation from mortal to vessel. One minute you were a man walking on goat-trodden streets, the next you were barefoot in eternity. And then there was the great sandal mystery. A papyrus now lost but referenced in later scribal notes supposedly detailed a pair of ceremonial sandals made from crushed glass and embedded gems, completely unwearable, stunningly impractical, created not for feet, but as offerings. The scribe wrote, "They glittered with foolish holiness, no one could wear them, everyone bowed before them, the raven ignored them, their fate remains unknown. Some believe they were buried with a high priest, others think they were stolen by temple cats with unusually fancy taste." Back in the temple, priests moved in slow circles, from chamber to altar, from shadow to light, some barefoot, some sandaled, all committed to stepping correctly, silently, reverently. Even the process of standing had protocols, weight evenly distributed, toes facing the altar, heels aligned with the sacred threshold. It was less walking and more choreography disguised as devotion. Shoes, when they failed publicly, a snapped strap mid-prayer, a sticky sole that refused to detach from the floor. One infamous incident involved a priest stepping out of his sandal entirely during a procession, only to step directly on a cold offering bowl. The clang echoed through the chamber. No one spoke for the remainder of the ceremony. That sandal was never seen again. Yet despite all this, the paradox remained. To be holy, one had to touch the ground, but not too much. To walk humbly, but not barefoot in defiance of decorum. To wear shoes, but not let them make a fuss. It was a delicate dance of theology and toes. And through it all, the raven perched, untouched, untethered. It had no need of sandals, its claws left no sin. It had nothing to explain. So the priests kept walking, careful, balanced, occasionally limping, knowing that the gods might not see the soles of their feet, but they certainly noticed when someone tried to cheat the silence. Somewhere between the sacred oils and the powdered myrrh, between the chants and the featherlight linen, there was the spoon. Do not laugh, or do, quietly, because in the daily preparations of an Egyptian temple priest, few items were more consistently handled, polished and pondered than the humble ritual spoon. These were not your average kitchen implements. You would not find them ladling lentils or tucked in the folds of a novice's lunch cloth. These spoons were ceremonial, symbolic, and occasionally absurd. They stirred incense, they measured powders, They anointed idols. They acted, in short, as intermediaries, tiny shovels for the sacred. Each temple had its own preferred design. Some were long and flat, resembling spatulas carved by moonlight. Others were curved, delicately balanced, shaped like lotus petals or outstretched hands. A few, clearly designed by overachieving artisans, were sculpted in the form of swimming women, where the bowl of the spoon was a gracefully extended palm and the handle the elegant arc of a back. One temple, perhaps with more funding than sense, commissioned a spoon inlaid with lapis lazuli and shaped like a duck. The duck's wings formed the bowl. Its beak pointed proudly forward. No one knows what it was used for, but it remains one of the most widely reproduced items in museum gift shops. Spiritual utility aside, it stirs a respectable amount of tourist admiration. The daily role of the spoon was primarily to portion incense. Powders needed to be exact, not in weight but in impression. A priest using too much might risk overwhelming the statue. Too little, and the offering would look stingy. So the spoon became a tool of visual theology, enough to be reverent, not enough to look insecure. And it had to be handled just so, fingers placed 2/3 up the handle, with the thumb slightly forward, wrist straight, no trembling. The act of transferring incense from jar to brazier was meant to resemble both service and offering. Fumbling was unacceptable. A dropped spoon could derail a rite, or at least ruin your reputation for a few days. Priests trained for this. Not officially, of course, there was no spoon syllabus, but novices practiced in quiet corners, moving imaginary powder from empty bowls to hollow basins, with all the gravitas of anointing a god. Some used pebbles for realism, others, ambitious, practiced with actual ash and risked sneezing themselves out of favor. Historians still argue whether the spoon had symbolic meaning beyond the practical. Some claim it represented the priest's role as mediator, scooping human intention and offering it to the divine. Others insist it was just a tool, nothing more. A few suggest the spoons were actually sacred feminine symbols disguised as household items, though this theory mostly serves to generate scholarly debates that end in polite disagreements and unusually sharp footnotes. A fringe belief once claimed that spoons, if carved at the right moon phase, could absorb spiritual residue. One high priest allegedly carried a personal spoon wrapped in linen, stored in a box inside another box, all of which had to be unwrapped before each sunrise rite. His peers tolerated this as long as the rituals proceeded on time. When he began writing poems to the spoon, he was gently assigned to scroll maintenance. The raven never touched the spoon, but it watched, always from above, head tilted in what might have been curiosity or judgment, or perhaps just a vague confusion about why humans needed tools to handle dust. Spoons, despite their size, were heavily documented. Temple inventories listed them with care. 1 bronze spoon, lotus handle, slight nick. 3 wooden scoops, cedar, plain. 1 spoon, gold-leafed, owl motif, possibly cursed. That last entry appears only once, and no follow-up record exists. Make of that what you will. Priests were expected to clean their spoons after each use, not just for hygiene, but to prevent spiritual residue from contaminating future offerings. Some temples had dedicated spoon cleaning basins. Others assigned the task to junior attendants who did not complain quickly enough. The cleaning itself was a ritual. Rinse, dry, polish with soft cloth, whisper a thank you prayer. Yes, to the spoon, not loudly, just enough for the gods to overhear and presumably nod. Anecdotes of spoon-based mishaps exist. One priest, in the grip of a sleepless fast, accidentally stirred incense into a vessel of oil, rather than the brazier. The resulting smoke was alarming. A goat panicked. The ritual was paused for 15 minutes while everyone pretended nothing happened. The priest's spoon was retired, quietly, without ceremony. And yet some spoons became revered, passed down, honored, displayed behind temple altars where only the most senior priests could touch them. These spoons had names: voice of flame, the quiet offering, bowl of the first fragrance. Naming a spoon might seem excessive, but in a world where gods judged breath and posture, a well-named spoon was just smart strategy. Spoon theft, rare but real, was treated severely. not because of material value, but because of the implied sacrilege. One scribe records an incident where a novice attempted to smuggle a decorated spoon into his personal quarters. He was discovered. His punishment, reciting the full incense hymn from memory, backward, while holding the spoon over his head. He succeeded, barely. More impressive was the spoon duel. Two priests, both assigned incense duty for a major festival, arrived at the brazier at the same time. Both believed they had precedence. Neither would yield. What followed was not violence, but performance, a carefully synchronized double incense offering, with each priest mirroring the other's scoop and pour. The crowd was mesmerized. The gods, one hopes, were amused. The spoons were returned to their shelves unharmed. Fringe rituals emerged. Some believed that tapping the spoon 3 times on the jar's edge ensured balance. Others kissed the handle's base before use, quietly, behind a curtain. One eccentric temple insisted that the spoon must be rotated clockwise twice before each scoop to align with cosmic order. Their incense burnt beautifully, but took 3 times as long to prepare. The most unusual spoon was not used at all. Carved from black basalt, polished until it gleamed like obsidian, it had no bowl, only a long pointed tip. The inscription read, "For what cannot be stirred." No one is sure what that means. It remains on display in a locked cabinet, beneath a sign that reads, "Do not touch, not even slightly." And still the raven watched. One eye on the brazier, one on the scooping. The spoon moved, the smoke rose, the gods said nothing. In the end, the spoon was just a spoon, and also not just a spoon. It was a conduit, a measure, a gesture. It did not speak. It did not gleam with divine fire. But in the hands of a priest, steady, shaved, powdered, oiled, it became part of the choreography of belief, a sacred utensil in the eternal kitchen of ritual. And when all the stirring was done, and the powders returned to their jars, and the brazier left to smolder in its own dignity, the spoon was cleaned, laid down, rested. It had done its job. Imagine this: the temple is quiet, the chants begin to echo from the inner sanctum, and the morning sun is just beginning to stretch its golden fingers over the whitewashed walls. Everything gleams, including the heads of the priests, except for one. One of them has made a grave mistake, a soft shadow along the jaw, a hint of texture above the upper lip, something unshaved. No one says anything. They do not have to. The silence shifts ever so slightly, like someone opened a window into social judgment. Even the raven pauses mid-breath, 1 foot raised, deciding whether to perch or simply leave the scene altogether. To serve in the temple of an Egyptian god required many things: purity of mind, strict diet, a deep knowledge of hymns, and above all, physical cleanliness. And for men, that meant a complete and thorough removal of hair. Not just once, not just often, but constantly, daily. In some temples, 3 times a day, sunrise, midday, sunset. Shave or risk spiritual irrelevance. So what happened when someone forgot? The records are, as you might expect, silent. Officially, no priest ever failed to shave. It simply did not occur. Everyone was perfect. Every jawline was smooth, and even the gods politely ignored razor burn. But unofficially, we can piece together hints, side glances in scrolls, offhand remarks in training tablets, and the occasional sarcastic notation beside an inventory of razors. Missing one, presumably misplaced, not neglected. Historians still argue whether the consequences of skipping a shave were administrative or apocalyptic. Some say the priest would be quietly removed from duties and sent to fast and reflect. Others believe a missed shave could halt an entire ritual, requiring re-sanctification of the space. One scholar even proposes that temple animals, particularly cats, could detect stubble and would hiss accordingly. No firm proof, but the image is compelling. A fringe belief held that unshaved skin acted as a barrier between the soul and the gods. Hair, according to this theory, muffled spiritual resonance. The longer it remained, the harder it was for the divine to hear you. This may explain the obsessively smooth armpits depicted in temple art, though some argue that was simply artistic preference. Others suspect it was also to prevent sweat-related embarrassment. There is, however, one recorded incident. A high-ranking priest entered the sanctuary with visible stubble. It was faint, barely noticeable. He may have been rushing, or perhaps his copper razor had dulled and no replacement could be found. He attempted to continue his duties, and the gods did not strike him down, but the chief lector priest noticed. A note in the temple register reads simply, "Purity interrupted, ceremony delayed, remediation commenced." No further details are provided, but the priest's name does not appear again in any temple rolls for the next 7 months. The raven, it is said, remained still throughout the entire incident, neither approving nor disapproving, just waiting. It knew perhaps that judgment belongs to the gods and the grooming belongs to mortals. Shaving, you see, was not just an act of maintenance, it was devotion with a blade. The priest stood over a basin, light streaming in, and removed everything: scalp, cheeks, jaw, upper lip, chin, underarms, chest, even though few like to discuss it, the lower regions, all of it, gone, scraped away with a copper blade, sometimes dipped in oil, occasionally followed by powder. Smoothness was next to godliness, and any hair left behind was a spiritual oversight. Slight bleeding was not unusual. One scroll lists cloths for minor sacrifice, presumably used to dab tiny nicks. The irony of bloodletting in the name of cleanliness is never addressed. Perhaps the gods appreciated the effort, but miss a shave entirely. That was a transgression. And like many transgressions in highly ritualized societies, it was often punished with nothing. No lightning, no curses, just quiet disapproval, social exile. The priest might still attend ceremony, but from the periphery, no duties, no chance, a kind of sacred time-out. They would be expected to shave immediately, of course, and then undergo a purification rite involving water, incense, linen, and a few choice verses from the Hymn of Inner Clarity. One temple in Upper Egypt supposedly required an offending priest to kneel in the courtyard, head bowed, while novices recited purity laws aloud slowly, for 3 hours, under the sun, wearing double layers of linen. Whether this actually cleansed the soul or just ensured compliance through discomfort is unclear, possibly both. And if the unshaved priest happened to be leading a ritual, that was trickier. But some temples had backup priests, already shaved, already prepared, already watching, ready to step in with all the grace of someone who has absolutely noticed your stubble and is thrilled to take your place. These substitutes were rarely promoted, but they lived in hope. A missed shave was their divine opening. There is also a statue, small, limestone, badly worn, that some believe depicts a penitent priest shaving by torchlight, blade poised, face solemn. A tiny inscription at the base reads, "He remembered." Whether this refers to the act of shaving or the consequences of forgetting, scholars are still debating. And then there was the legend of the stubbled prophet, almost certainly fictional, though beloved. In this tale, a priest receives a vision from a minor deity warning him not to shave for 3 days. He obeys, hair returns, the other priests recoil, he is expelled. But on the 4th day, he receives divine wisdom, carves it into stone, and disappears into the desert. The stone, of course, has never been found, but the story is often told when razors go missing. The raven, naturally, features in the tale. It lands on the prophet's shoulder, does not speak, does not pluck, just perches, feather to whisker, as if to say, some mysteries itch before they are understood. Temples maintained large inventories of shaving equipment. Razors were sacred objects. They were catalogued, sharpened, and blessed. A shaving blade dropped on the ground was considered temporarily impure. Some priests refused to reuse a razor more than 5 times. Others insisted that shaving must always begin from the left cheek and proceed clockwise. Larger temples had shaving rooms, brightly lit, ventilated, scented with citrus and crushed reed. Novices shaved each other under supervision, learning technique and pressure control. One training scroll reads, "Too soft, and the gods hear nothing. Too hard, and you bleed for their silence." And if you were truly desperately unable to shave, there was always delegation. In rare cases, a trusted fellow priest might perform the ritual for you, slowly, reverently, blade held like a stylus, face treated like papyrus. It was an intimate act, perhaps the closest 2 priests could get without violating their vows. And still, the shame lingered. because shaving was not a shared responsibility, it was a personal covenant with cleanliness. To skip it was not just to forget, it was to reject. And rejection, in the eyes of Egyptian theology, was often worse than ignorance. The unshaved priest was not untrained, he was undevoted. That, more than hair, required correction. So they shaved, relentlessly, even when tired, even when sore, even when the blade was dull and the water cold and the sun already rising. They shaved, because the gods might not blink, but they noticed. And in the rafters, the raven remained, one eye half closed, watching, waiting, probably wondering what it would take for humans to molt properly and be done with it. The gods have gone quiet for the night. Their statues rest beneath veils of shadow, unmoving, their polished surfaces dimmed in the hush that follows ritual. The incense has burned itself to a soft ring of grey ash in the brazier. The oil lamps sputter once, briefly, then surrender to the dark. The temple holds its breath, not because anything is wrong, but because nothing is left to say. Even the razors have been laid down, clean, dried, set blade down in their carved holders with handles turned respectfully to the east, as if the coming sunrise deserves to be greeted by sharpened silence. The priests are gone now, folded away into their quarters behind walls that smell faintly of warm stone and sacred oils. They sleep without ceremony, or they sit in thought, heads smooth beneath linen wraps, their thoughts echoing the hum of rituals repeated 1,000 times. Outside, somewhere in the night, a desert wind whispers through the reed fences, and the shadows do not answer. They never do. And above, in the rafters of the sanctuary, the raven shifts. Just once, one claw, a quiet motion, no wing, no sound. It is not looking at anything in particular, just watching the room as it exhales. This is the moment when history stops trying. The scrolls are rolled. The pigment is dry on the last statue's eye. Even the temple cats have found somewhere to sleep, curled beside warm alcoves or tucked under offering tables. The night belongs to stillness. You are not expected to remember everything. That is not the point. This story, like all slow stories told in temples and bedrooms and between the folds of sleep, is not meant to be memorized. It is meant to be felt, like cool stone beneath bare feet, like the weight of linen on a freshly oiled shoulder, like the quiet tug of a sandal strap, pulled just tight enough to remind you that you are standing in a place that matters. You might recall the razors, or the endless jars of powder, the spoon, the powdered green malachite, the soft scrape of a blade over a jaw, too tired to protest, or perhaps nothing at all, just a sense of precision and patience, both slowly disappearing behind you like footprints in a basin of water. It does not matter. This temple you have walked through tonight, with its rituals, its strange rules, its ever-watchful silence, is not asking anything of you. It does not want action, or answers, or anything really. Only that you rest a moment longer in the presence of things that take themselves too seriously, and in doing so become slightly ridiculous, and slightly beautiful. There is a kind of peace in systems too old to update. Everything in the temple was done for a reason. The shaving, the wrapping, the bathing, the silence, the posture of the feet, the layering of linen, the angle of the spoon, the exact moment incense was stirred, and the precise silence that followed. All of it meant something, even if that meaning was largely forgotten over centuries and merely performed out of habit by the end. But habit is holy in places like these. That is the secret of the priests. Not that they believed everything, but that they continued everything, day after day, season after season. They stepped into the same shadows, folded the same cloths, offered the same powders to the same unmoving statues, and left, quietly, as if the act itself mattered more than the outcome. And that, perhaps, is why the gods never had to speak, because the silence was doing fine without them. Now you may feel the weight of linen on your limbs, not real, of course, but remembered, or imagined, a side effect of sitting too long in another person's strange old world. You might feel the faintest trace of oil behind your ears, a powdered sandal strap pressing against your heel, the cool memory of shaved skin beneath moonlight. These are normal. Let them stay as long as they like. They will leave on their own. No one is asking you to chant, or to bow, or to stir anything sacred. You are done with that for the night. The brazier in the sanctuary has gone dark. It has left behind the smell of dried myrrh and warm clay. The scrolls on the lecterns have been covered in cloth. The reed brushes used for copying sacred text rest in a cup of clean water. The statue of the god, whoever they were, whichever animal mask they wore, stares forward into the gloom, just as they always do, seeing nothing but being seen by everything. And the raven, still in the rafters, has not moved. It does not blink. It does not yawn. It simply is. Perhaps you noticed it once or twice, on a beam, in a corner, beside a window. It was there in every section of the temple. It was not invited. It never had to be. Some things do not need permission to linger. If you feel tired now, that is correct. Not exhausted, not drained, just gently worn down, like a well-used blade, dull in the good way, safe, finished. Even the temple needs rest. Even marble columns want to lean a little when no one is looking. The scent of sanctity fades after a while, and the air is just air again. Nothing wrong with that. There is nothing more to learn. No twist ending. No great mystery. The most important detail, the one you might carry with you, was never the razors or the gods or the powders or the postures. It was simply this. Someone, a long time ago, tried very hard to be clean in a world that refused to be. That's the whole thing. Maybe that is what the raven understands. Maybe that is why it stays. It has seen every priest come and go, every stubble missed, every ritual flubbed, every sandal strap broken mid-procession, and still it sits, quietly amused maybe, at the idea that perfection was ever the goal. You have earned the right to forget. Let the smooth, symmetrical expectations slip from your mind like a linen sash untied at the end of a long procession. Let your thoughts fall out of order. Let your shoulders release their memory of posture. The gods, if they are watching, are not judging. They are statues. If they blink, it is only because the light moved. There may still be a small noise outside your own temple tonight. A dog, a passing cart, a gust of wind that thinks it is a prophet. Let it pass. Even sacred places live beside ordinary things, especially sacred places. And now, the room around you may begin to feel quieter. Not just because the voice has stopped guiding you through time, but because something in your body has decided to join the silence. Let it. It is not sleep. Not yet, but it is something close enough to count. The brazier is cool. The ink is dry. The linen has been folded. The doors to the temple have not been locked, but they have been gently closed, not to keep you in, not to keep anything out, but to let everything inside go still, together. There will be other nights, other temples to be and to bull, other stories told too slowly for the impatient. But for now the history has ended where it always ends, not with a grand gesture, but with the simple realization that no one is speaking anymore, and no one needs to. Let your thoughts, if they still wander, settle like ash in a bowl of quiet embers. Let your hands rest, unused, as if still holding a spoon that has already done its work. Let your eyes drift, if they are open at all, toward the space where a raven might sit, watching, waiting for nothing in particular, just there. No need to say goodnight. That would imply someone is still awake. And no need to stir. The ritual is over. The silence is the exit. Just let go now. You have been shaved, bathed, powdered, oiled, and robed in story. There is nothing left but softness, and perhaps in the distance, a final feather drifting downward. Not yours, not the raven's, just part of the night, gently closing itself around you.